Ezra was born into a world of chaos and violence. Although he was smart and charismatic, he never stood a chance at a normal life. The youngest of three siblings, he grew up in a crumbling tenement in a forgotten corner of the city, where police sirens and gunshots were as constant as the hum of electricity. His mother, a struggling addict, was often too high or too overwhelmed to protect her children from the dangers outside or the horrors within their own home. His father, a shadowy figure in the local underworld, was a man of unpredictable rage. When he was around, the atmosphere crackled with tension. Ezra learned early that silence and submission were his only defenses against the blows that came without warning. By the time Ezra was 6, he had already witnessed his father beat his mother to death over a missing stash of drugs. The memory of her lifeless body sprawled on the kitchen floor while his siblings huddled in the closet was seared into his mind. During that night, as his father was subdued by law enforcement, his older brother tried to take control, promising they would escape one day. Ezra and his siblings were placed with his auntie, a woman who was not only mean-spirited at times, but also sold her body to the streets. You see, the dreams of escape were futile in a neighborhood where poverty acted as a trap and violence was the only currency of survival. School was no sanctuary for Ezra. His unkempt appearance and volatile temper made him a target for ridicule and later fights. The beatings he endured at home by his auntie and the many men who she entertained have forged him into a fighter. Each playground brawl became a rehearsal for the street wars that would define his adolescence. By the time he was a teenager, Ezra had dropped out entirely, trading books and pencils for the camaraderie of the streets. Once on the street, Ezra connected with some fellow flunkies and was introduced to an up-and-coming gang called Zone Mob. The members consisted of low-level and moderate street criminals looking for protection and insulation from their crimes and immoral actions. The gang's initiation was brutal, but for Ezra, it was just another form of violence he'd endured his entire life. His first job, robbing a corner store, left him trembling, but the old members praised him for his grit. That praise, a twisted form of validation, filled a void he didn't even realize he had. Over time, the missions escalated, beatdowns, extortions, and eventually murder. Each act chipped away at the boy he once was, replacing him with a man hardened by necessity and numbered by the belief that this was all life could ever offer. Yet beneath the bravado and cold exterior, Ezra carried scars of his upbringing. His violent childhood had taught him that trust was dangerous and vulnerability was fatal. The love he had once felt for his siblings faded after his older brother was gunned down in a gang dispute and his sister disappeared, likely swallowed by the same streets that had consumed their parents. Alone in the world, Ezra clung to the gang life, finding solace in its chaos and survival in its ruthlessness. Zone Mob became his family, offering him structure and loyalty he had never found at home. It was his upbringing, a cycle of trauma, neglect, and violence that molded Ezra into the enforcer he became. Each crime he committed felt like an extension of his past, as if every act of destruction brought him closer to the broken boy who had once huddled in that closet, powerless and afraid. But no matter how high he rose in the ranks, the ghost of his childhood followed him, whispering reminders of a humanity he tried desperately to bury. Ezra, or Ezo, as his affiliates now called him, had built a life on destruction. Raised in chaos and hardened by the streets, he ascended the ranks of the notorious Zone Mob by now earning a reputation as the cold-blooded enforcer. His defining moment came when he executed an unthinkable order, the murder of an entire family. Parents and their 2 children over a botched drug deal. At the time, he felt nothing. It was just another job, another step deeper into darkness. The act of murdering an entire family was so uneventful to Ezo that after it was completed, He went to the local restaurant and had breakfast. Ezra was beyond cold and beyond calculated. But life has a way of demanding penance. When the law finally closed in on Zone Mob, Ezra, being as savvy, saw an opportunity for survival and took it. As the prosecution's star witness, he delivered the testimony that dismantled the organization, but at a devastating personal cost. His longtime girlfriend, Lana, the woman who endured his cheating ways, drug selling, and abuse, paid the ultimate price for his betrayal. Her house was burned to the ground in retaliation, with her nude and tattered body laying on the bed, burned beyond recognition. He learned through word of mouth that her body still showed signs of the torture she endured before she and her home were doused with the gas and engulfed by the hunger of the flames. Alone and consumed by guilt, Ezra entered the Witness Protection Program, where he spent a year shuffling through anonymous motels and haunted by the ghosts of his past. Now under a new identity, Ezra had been placed in a decaying city riddled with its own brand of violence. His assigned job, bitterly ironic, was a biological waste remover at a funeral home, a grim task that forced him to confront death daily. Ezra's job was both a punishment and a dark mirror reflecting his past. Every day he donned gloves and a heavy apron, stepping into the cold, sterile rooms where death hung thick in the air. His tasks were grotesque and unrelenting, handling blood-soaked linens, disposing of organs removed during autopsies, and scrubbing away at the remnants of lives lost too soon. The stench of formaldehyde and the decay clung to his clothes no matter how much he scrubbed, serving as an inescapable reminder of the destruction he had once brought to others. For Ezra, the job was a grim penance, forcing him to confront mortality in its raw and most unflinching forms. The irony of his work wasn't lost on him. In the Zone Mob, he had been a dealer of death, his hands stained with the lives he had taken. Now he was tasked with cleaning up its aftermath. Each piece of tissue and each bag of viscera he disposed of felt like a piece of his own soul being torn away. The worst moments were when families arrived to identify their loved ones, grieving mothers and sobbing children whose anguish cut deeper than any blade. Though they never looked twice at the man in the corner hauling the biohazard bins, Ezra felt their judgment like a spotlight, exposing the monster he once had become. See, the job wasn't just a means of survival. It was a daily reckoning, stripping away the layers of denial he had built to shield himself from the weight of his crimes. His home, a small dilapidated house on a desolate road, set directly from a sprawling cemetery. The arrangement felt like a cruel cosmic joke, a constant reminder of the lives he had destroyed. At first, Ezra tried to make the best of it. He kept his head down, avoided trouble, and went about his grotesque work in silence. But the psychological strain began to wear him down. The clink of the bones against the steel trays, the chemical stench of preservation fluids, and the whispered prayers of grieving families became his soundtrack. Night after night, the cemetery across the street loomed in a taunting specter, its shadows stretching into his dreams. Then came the noises. It began with a faint sobbing, drifting through the cracked windows of his bedroom. He dismissed it as wind, but the sound grew clearer over time. Agonized wails interpierced with high-pitched cries, like children calling for their mother. Ezra found himself waking up drenched in sweat, his dreams plagued by shadowy figures and whispered accusations. One night, he finally dared to look outside, and his blood turned to ice. There, illuminated by the flickering glow of the street lamp, stood a family of 4. Their forms were unmistakable. The father's tall, imposing frame, the mother clutching the youngest child to her chest, the elder son standing solemnly at her side. Their eyes, dark and hollow, were fixed on him with unrelenting intensity. The most convincing and demented part of what Ezra witnessed was that the faces of each family members were frozen in place, and on their faces was the last expression of fear they had had when their lives were callously taken by the weight of Ezra's deeds. Ezra staggered back from the window, his heart pounding. It couldn't be real. Yet the family's silent vigil continued night after night, always in the same spot and always staring. Ezra tried to ignore them, but they began appearing in other places, reflected in the mirrors at work, glimpses in the rearview mirror as he drove home, and even standing at the foot of his bed when he jolted awake from restless sleep. The funeral home became a place of torment as well. Bodies began arriving with eerily familiar features. A child with the same pleading eyes as the little girl he killed. A man whose face mirrored the father. Each corpse seemed to bear a personal message, a horrifying nod to his past crimes. The walls of the home seemed to close in, whispers seeping from the embalming room, doors creaking open on their own. Once as he drained a body, the corpse's mouth seemed to move, rasping, "Do you remember us?" The cemetery, once a passive presence, began to shift as well. Gravestones appeared where they had not been before, their inscriptions ineligible, yet somehow familiar. One night, while driving home, Ezra swore he saw shadows moving between the headstones, their limbs bending in unnatural ways. Desperate, Ezra reached out to his handler in the program, an old FBI agent whose years were far shorter than the years that had already passed. Ezra begged to be relocated, confessing to the agent what he was forced to endure. "You're imagining things. Stay put, Ezo," he said sarcastically. "It's for your own safety. Besides, you should feel lucky that you have the safety of this program." "You rat bastard," the agent said, but safety had become an illusion. As the days blurred into nights, Ezra unraveled. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and stopped caring. One night, driven to the brink of madness, he stepped outside to confront the specters. "What do you want from me?" he screamed into the darkness. The family simply stared back, silent but unyielding. However, the youngest child raised their hand, pointing at the cemetery. Ezra, although terrified, couldn't help but sense some sort of twisted relief that finally he was given an answer. Now mentally broken by his tormentors and against his better judgment, Ezra followed. The cemetery stretched infinitely into the darkness, the graves yawning like open mouths. The family led him to an unmarked grave at the edge of the lot. As Ezra stared down into the void, a memory surfaced, a faint glimmer of the man he used to be. The grave began to shift, soil crumbling away to reveal a coffin. Inside lay his own body, pale and lifeless, the face frozen in an expression of terror that resembled the many faces of death at his very own hands. Then the realization struck him like a thunderous clap. He had been dead all along. This existence, this torment, was his penance. The family began to encircle him, their forms decaying before his eyes. Their whispers filled his ears, voices not of anger, but of sorrow, asking a single question. "Do you remember us?" Ezra fell to his knees, the weight of his guilt crushing him. He begged for forgiveness, but the family's eyes remained cold. The whispers grew louder, morphing into a deafening cacophony. The earth beneath him opened, and he voluntarily plunged into darkness. The next morning, the funeral home staff found Ezra's body hanging in the embalming room, his face frozen in horror, His hands were covered in dirt, and the smell of decay lingered in the air. However, the authorities ruled his death a suicide, but no one could explain the faint outlines of handprints on the walls, nor the small footprints leading away from his body in the embalming room. And across the street, in the window of Ezra's abandoned house, a shadowy figure could be seen staring out into the cemetery